They threw mud at the obese girl and called her pig. The mountain man made them eat dirt. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Dry Creek, a ramshackle settlement nestled in the untamed wilderness of the Western Territories. It was 1827, and the town consisted of little more than a dozen wooden structures clustered around a dusty main thoroughfare that turned to impassable mud whenever the rains came. The place smelled of horse manure, coal smoke, and the perpetual stench of unwashed bodies cramped together in a lawless land. Lydia Hartwell emerged from her father's blacksmith shop, carrying a wicker basket laden with bread loaves she'd baked before dawn. At 19 years old, she stood barely 5 feet tall, but weighed considerably more than most men in town. Her round face perpetually flushed with exertion, and her homespun dress patched and repatched strained across her ample frame. She kept her eyes downcast as she walked, a habit born from years of cruel stares and crueler words. She had not always been this way. As a child, Lydia had been thin and quick, helping her mother tend the small garden behind the smithy. But when the fever came through Dry Creek 5 years ago, it took her mother and left her father, Thomas Hartwell, a broken man with a chronic cough that rattled his chest like stones in a tin can. The illness had damaged his lungs, leaving him unable to work the forge for more than an hour at a time. The burden of survival fell entirely on Lydia's shoulders. She took over the household, learned to bake bread to sell, tended the forge when her father couldn't breathe, and absorbed every insult the town threw at her. The weight came gradually from eating the scraps and burnt portions so her father could have the good food, from the exhaustion that made movement painful, from the depression that settled over her like a heavy blanket she couldn't shake off. "Well, well, well, look what's waddling down the street." The voice belonged to Cole Brennan, a lanky 20-year-old with a face full of pockmarks and a temperament as nasty as spoiled meat. He lounged outside the saloon with his usual companions, his younger brother Wade, Buck Morrison, and 2 other young men whose fathers owned the general store and the livery stable, respectively. They had nothing to do with their days except drink weak whiskey, gamble away money they didn't earn, and torment anyone weaker than themselves. Lydia's heart sank. She'd hoped to make it to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house before they noticed her. The elderly widow bought 3 loaves every Saturday to feed her boarders, and that money kept the Hartwells from starving. But the saloon stood directly between the smithy and the boarding house, and there was no other route. "Keep walking," she whispered to herself. "Just keep walking." "Hey, pig, I'm talking to you." Cole pushed away from the hitching post and sauntered into her path. His companions followed, forming a loose semicircle that blocked her way. Lydia stopped, clutching her basket tighter. "Please, I need to deliver these before they get cold." "Before they get cold?" Wade Brennan mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "Listen to Miss Piggy worrying about her precious bread." He grabbed a handful of dirt from the street and flung it at her. The dust exploded across her chest, leaving brown streaks on her faded blue dress. "Stop it," Lydia said quietly, though she knew pleading never helped. "Or what?" Buck Morrison, a thick-necked brute who worked occasionally at the livery when his father forced him, stepped closer. "You gonna sit on us? Whole town would sink into the ground." The others laughed, their voices sharp and mocking. A few townsfolk paused to watch, but no one intervened. This was entertainment in Dry Creek, the daily humiliation of Lydia Hartwell. Some watched with amusement, others with pity, but none with enough compassion to stop it. Cole snatched the basket from her hands. "What have we got here? Bread. This looks like pig slop to me, boys." "Give it back." Lydia reached for the basket, but Cole held it high above his head. When she tried to grab it, he shoved her backward. She stumbled, her worn shoes slipping in the loose dirt, and fell hard on her backside. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. Look at that! The ground actually shook. Wade howled with laughter. Cole upended the basket, dumping the loaves into the dirt. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he ground his boot heel into one of them. "Oops. So sorry, Miss Piggy." Lydia scrambled forward on her hands and knees, trying to salvage the bread. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to shed in front of them. Each loaf represented hours of work, kneading dough with her aching arms, tending the fire, measuring their precious flour. Without the money from selling them, she and her father wouldn't eat tomorrow. "This one's not dirty enough yet," Buck said, grabbing another loaf. But instead of throwing it down, he scooped up a handful of mud from the horse trough and smeared it across the bread before tossing it at Lydia. It struck her shoulder, leaving a dark, wet stain. "Pig covered in mud," Cole crowed. "That's where she belongs, boys wallowing in the muck with the rest of the swine." They began pelting her with mud and dirt, laughing uproariously as she curled into a ball, protecting her head with her arms. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, some chuckling along with the tormentors, others looking away uncomfortably, but doing nothing. "That's enough." The voice cut through the laughter like a blade through silk, low, gravelly, and absolutely devoid of humor. The sudden silence that followed was so complete that Lydia could hear her own ragged breathing and the distant whinny of a horse. She dared to look up through tear-blurred eyes. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a figure that seemed to have materialized from the wilderness itself. He stood well over 6 feet tall, possibly 6.5, with shoulders so broad they blocked the sun. His face was weathered leather, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth, with a thick beard shot through with gray. He wore a heavy coat made from bearskin despite the warm weather, and his boots were wrapped in what looked like mountain lion hide. But it was his eyes that made Lydia's breath catch pale gray eyes that looked like chips of winter ice, cold and utterly emotionless as they swept over the scene before him. Jeb Carter. She'd heard the name whispered in town, always with a mixture of fear and fascination. The mountain man of Redstone Ridge. He came down from his cabin in the high country maybe 3 or 4 times a year to trade pelts and buy supplies, then disappeared back into the wilderness. Stories about him varied wildly. Some said he'd been a soldier who'd gone mad after the war. Others claimed he'd killed his own brother in a dispute over a woman, and still others swore he'd single-handedly wiped out a gang of 15 outlaws who'd murdered his family. What everyone agreed on was that Jeb Carter was not a man to be trifled with. Cole Brennan recovered first, his youth and bravado making him stupid. "This ain't your business, old man. We're just having a bit of fun with the local pig." Jeb's expression didn't change. He reached into his coat and pulled out a rolled cigarette, struck a match against his thumbnail, and lit it. The smoke curled upward as he took a long drag, his ice-chip eyes never leaving Cole's face. "You think that's fun?" Jeb asked finally, his voice soft enough that people leaned in to hear. "Throwing mud at a woman half your size while your friends watch?" "She ain't no woman," Buck interjected, emboldened by alcohol and stupidity. She's a fat pig who—" He never finished the sentence. Jeb moved with shocking speed for a man his size, crossing the distance in 3 long strides. His fist connected with Buck's jaw with a sound like an axe biting into wood. Buck's head snapped back, and he crumpled to the ground unconscious before he hit the dirt. Wade Brennan grabbed for the pistol at his belt, but Jeb's hand shot out and seized the young man's wrist. There was a sickening crack, the sound of small bones breaking, and Wade shrieked in pain, dropping the gun. "You broke my wrist! You crazy bastard! You broke my—" Jeb's other hand closed around Wade's throat, cutting off his words. He lifted the young man onto his toes, holding him there effortlessly while Wade's face turned purple. "Pick up the bread," Jeb said quietly, looking at Cole. "All of it, and put it back in the basket. Clean." Cole's bravado had evaporated. His face had gone pale, and his hands trembled as he bent to retrieve the scattered loaves. The other young men had melted back into the crowd, suddenly very interested in being anywhere else. Jeb released Wade, who collapsed to his knees, gasping and clutching his throat. The mountain man turned his attention to Cole, who was frantically brushing dirt off the bread with shaking hands. "You think this is clean?" Jeb asked, examining one of the loaves. Without warning, he grabbed Cole by the hair and forced his face down toward a puddle of muddy water near the horse trough. "You like playing in mud so much? Then play." "No, please, Cole's words turned to gurgles as Jeb shoved his face into the puddle. The mountain man held him there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds before pulling him up, allowing him to gasp for air, then pushing him down again. He repeated this process with each of the young men who'd participated in tormenting Lydia. By the time he was finished, all 5 of them knelt in the mud, coughing and retching, their faces and clothes covered in filth. The crowd watched in stunned silence. No one had ever stood up to Cole Brennan and his gang before. They were the sons of the town's most prosperous citizens, untouchable in their cruelty, until now. Jeb straightened, breathing evenly despite the exertion. He pulled a leather pouch from his belt, extracted several coins, and tossed them onto the bar of the saloon where the owner stood, gaping. "That's for the bread these boys ruined," Jeb said, "and for any complaints their fathers might have about their treatment." The saloon keeper, a weaselly man named Pettigrew, scrambled to collect the coins. "No complaints here, Mr. Carter. No complaints at all. Boys had it coming. Everyone knows it." Jeb turned finally to Lydia, who still sat in the dirt, staring up at him with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He extended a hand, a massive hand, calloused and scarred, but surprisingly steady. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head mutely and took his hand. He pulled her to her feet with such ease it was as though she weighed nothing. Up close, she could see that his gray eyes weren't entirely cold. There was something in their depths, a carefully controlled pain that he kept locked away behind an iron will. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked, picking up her basket and examining the ruined bread. "Mrs. Patterson's boarding house," Lydia managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the bread is ruined. She won't buy it now." "Then you'll come with me," Jeb said simply. "Got a cabin up on Redstone Ridge. Could use someone to cook and keep the place while I'm out trapping. Pays not much, but it's regular, and nobody up there will throw mud at you." Lydia's mind reeled. Leave Dry Creek? Leave her father? But even as the questions formed, she realized she couldn't go back to the smithy empty-handed, couldn't face another day of this humiliation, couldn't watch her father waste away because she couldn't earn enough to feed them both. "My father?" she said. "He's sick. I can't leave him alone." Jeb nodded slowly, as though he'd expected this. "The money I'm offering, you send it back to him. Should be enough for him to hire a boy to help with the forge. More than you're making selling bread these vultures keep destroying." He wasn't asking. He was offering her a way out, and they both knew it might be her only chance. Lydia looked back at the crowd, at Cole and his friends still kneeling in the mud, at the townsfolk who'd watched her suffer for years without lifting a finger to help. Then she looked up at the mountain man with his cold gray eyes and his unexpected mercy. "When do we leave?" she asked. The journey to Redstone Ridge took 2 days of hard travel. Jeb kept a punishing pace, his long legs eating up the miles, while Lydia struggled to keep up on the old mare he'd provided. He'd stopped at the smithy just long enough for her to explain the situation to her father, that she'd be working for wages in the high country, that money would be sent down regularly. Thomas Hartwell had looked at Jeb Carter with eyes that understood more than words could convey, had clasped his daughter's hand with his thin, trembling fingers, and had given his blessing. Now, as they climbed higher into the mountains, Dry Creek became a distant memory below them. The air grew thinner and colder. Pine trees towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out the sun in places. Lydia had never been this far from town. The wilderness was beautiful in a savage, indifferent way, beautiful and terrifying. They stopped only once each day, making camp as darkness fell. Jeb built fires with practiced efficiency, cooked simple meals of salt pork and beans, and spoke perhaps 10 words total. He wasn't unfriendly, merely silent, as though he'd forgotten how to make conversation during his years alone on the mountain. On the second afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Lydia saw the cabin for the first time. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by enormous pines, built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a small stable stood nearby. Behind the cabin, a stream tumbled down over rocks, its sound a constant musical backdrop. "This is it," Jeb said, the most obvious statement he'd made in 2 days. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but surprisingly clean. A large fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking pot hanging on an iron hook. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat near the hearth. Against the far wall stood a single bed with a bearskin blanket. Shelves held basic supplies, flour, salt, coffee, sugar, and hooks on the walls displayed various pelts in various stages of curing. "You take the bed," Jeb said, setting down her small bundle of possessions. "I'll sleep outside or in the stable. Privy's out back, streams behind the cabin for washing. You cook, clean, mend what needs mending. In winter, you'll help cure the pelts. I'll be gone most days, trapping or hunting. Money gets sent down to your father once a month when I go to trade." "Where will you sleep?" Lydia asked, troubled by the idea of taking his bed. "Don't matter. I've slept on worse than dirt floors." Before she could protest further, he turned and walked back outside, leaving her alone in what was now apparently her home. The first weeks passed in a strange, silent rhythm. Lydia rose before dawn, rekindled the fire, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and prepared breakfast, usually cornmeal mush or Johnny cakes. Jeb would eat quickly, nod his thanks, and disappear into the forest with his rifle and traps. She wouldn't see him again until dusk, when he'd return with game or pelts to be cleaned and processed. She filled her days with work. The cabin had been neglected for years, and she attacked the grime with determination. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, patched holes in the chinked walls. She organized the chaos of Jeb's supplies, finding dried herbs and vegetables that had been shoved into corners and forgotten. She mended his clothes shirts with torn sleeves, pants with holes worn through at the knees, and even managed to make the rough bearskin blanket more bearable by stitching in a lining made from an old wool coat she found buried in a chest. Jeb said nothing about these improvements. He simply used what she'd repaired and slept on what she'd mended without comment. Lydia couldn't tell if he even noticed, but gradually small changes appeared. One morning she woke to find fresh venison hanging in the larder, far more than one man could eat before it spoiled. Another day she discovered someone had repaired the wobbly leg on her chair. A week later there was a new dress hanging on a peg by the door, made from simple homespun but in a size that would actually fit her, not like the straining patched monstrosity she'd worn from Dry Creek. They still rarely spoke, but the silence became less oppressive. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind shared by two people who understood that words weren't always necessary. Then came the night everything changed. Lydia woke to the sound of violent coughing coming from the stable. She lay in the darkness listening, trying to convince herself she'd imagined it. But the coughing came again, harsh and wet, followed by an ominous silence. She wrapped the bearskin around her shoulders and hurried outside. The night was cold enough to make her breath fog, and stars blazed overhead in profusion impossible to see from the lowlands. The stable door stood slightly ajar. Inside, in the dim light of a failing lantern, she found Jeb collapsed against the wall. His face was ashen, and blood bright red and terrifying stained his lips and chin. More blood spotted the ground beside him. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Lydia breathed, falling to her knees beside him. "What happened? Were you shot?" Jeb's eyes opened, focusing on her with difficulty. "Get back inside. I'm fine." "You're coughing blood. You are decidedly not fine." She grabbed the lantern and examined him more closely. No wounds, no injuries visible, which meant, "How long have you been sick?" He turned his face away. "Doesn't matter." "It matters to me." She was surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "You took me in when no one else would. You protected me. The least you can do is let me help you now." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "Started about a year ago. Coughing. Blood. Gets worse when the weather's cold. Doctor in Silver City said there's nothing to be done. Consumption, maybe, or something in the lungs from too many years breathing smoke and cold air." "And you thought you'd just come up here and die alone?" Lydia demanded. "Better up here than down in town where people would gawk." His voice was bitter. "Already got a grave picked out, up on the ridge where you can see the sunset. Was planning on taking care of it before the ground freezes." Lydia sat back on her heels, stunned. This man who seemed as indestructible as the mountains themselves was dying. And he'd brought her here not just to help him, but because he'd known he didn't have much time left and didn't want her to go back to the cruelty of Dry Creek after he was gone. The cabin would be hers. The small amount of money he'd saved would be hers. He'd been planning his death and trying to ensure she'd be taken care of. "You're not dying tonight," she said firmly, pushing aside the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Come on up. You're not sleeping in a stable like some kind of animal." I'm fine here. Do not argue with me, Jeb Carter." She grabbed his arm and hauled with all her strength. To her surprise, he let her help him up, leaning heavily on her shoulder as they made their way back to the cabin. She settled him on the bed the first time he'd slept there since she'd arrived, and built up the fire until the room was sweltering. Then she worked. She boiled water and made a poultice from pine resin and herbs she'd found growing near the stream. She'd watched her mother do the same for her father, though she knew it was more comfort than cure. She wrapped the poultice around his chest, forced him to drink hot tea made from willow bark for the pain, and sat beside the bed, keeping watch. In the depths of the night, when the fever made him delirious, he began to speak. "Danny, I'm sorry. Should have been me, not you." His hand clutched at the blankets, his face twisted in anguish. "The river was too high. I told you not to cross. God, I told you." Lydia took his hand, squeezing it gently. "It's all right. You're safe now." "He was only 12, Jeb continued, tears leaking from his closed eyes. "My little brother. I was supposed to protect him. Father said to bring him home before the storm hit. But I wanted to check one more trap line, one more, and the river rose so fast he fell in. I tried to reach him, but the current, I watched him go under, and I couldn't. His voice broke into sobs, harsh, wrenching sounds from a man who'd probably spent decades keeping that grief locked inside. Lydia found herself crying too, for this broken man who'd carried such a terrible burden for so long. She stayed beside him all night, cooling his fever with wet cloths, forcing him to drink water when he was conscious enough to swallow. When dawn finally broke, his fever had subsided and he slept peacefully for the first time in hours. Lydia sat back in the chair she'd pulled beside the bed, exhausted but triumphant. He would live. At least today, he would live. When Jeb finally woke, it was late afternoon. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in her disheveled appearance, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she'd dozed off in the chair beside him. "You should have left me in the stable," he said hoarsely, "and you should have told me you were dying instead of planning to do it alone like some noble idiot," she countered. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Been alone a long time. Forgot what it's like to have someone care." "Well, get used to it," Lydia said firmly, "because I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you if I have anything to say about it." Over the following days, as Jeb slowly regained his strength, something fundamental shifted between them. He began to talk more, haltingly at first, sharing stories of his life before he come to the mountains. She learned about Danny, the little brother who'd drowned 30 years ago, and how Jeb had run away from home afterward, unable to face his parents' grief. He'd drifted west, fought in skirmishes with various tribes, worked as a trapper and guide, and eventually ended up on Redstone Ridge, where he'd built the cabin with his own hands. "Was going to bring Danny out here once he was old enough," Jeb said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Show him the mountains, teach him to trap and hunt. But I killed that dream along with him." "You didn't kill him," Lydia said gently. "Accidents happen. Rivers rise. Children don't always listen. Carrying that guilt for 30 years won't bring him back." "You sound like you're speaking from experience." She nodded slowly. "My mother. The fever that killed her, I caught it first. Brought it home from town. She nursed me through it, and then she got sick. I lived. She died. For years I thought if I'd just stayed away from the other children, if I'd been more careful, she'd still be alive. And now? Now I think maybe death comes when it comes, and we do the best we can with the time we have. She looked at him directly. Which is why you're not giving up. You got time left, Jeb Carter, and we're going to use it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, why'd you get fat, Lydia? The question was blunt, almost rude, but she understood he was asking something deeper. Why had she let herself become a target? Why had she given them ammunition to use against her? After Mama died, I had to do everything. Work the forge, cook, clean, tend Papa. There wasn't time to take care of myself. And food was the only comfort I had. When everything hurt and everyone was cruel, at least bread and stew didn't judge me. She paused. And maybe part of me thought if I made myself ugly enough, people would just leave me alone. But that's not how cruelty works. It finds you anyway. You're not ugly, Jeb said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before, something almost gentle. Never were. Those boys are blind and stupid, and you're better than all of them combined. Lydia felt tears prick at her eyes. In all her 19 years, no one had ever said anything like that to her. Thank you. Just the truth, Jeb said gruffly, standing abruptly as though embarrassed by the sentiment. Think I'll turn in. You should, too. Tomorrow, we've got work to do. But as Lydia lay in the bed that night, Jeb had finally agreed to sleep on a pallet by the fire, rather than in the stable. She found herself smiling into the darkness. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been happiness. 6 weeks after arriving on Redstone Ridge, Lydia woke to the sound of distant thunder. She rose and stepped outside to find the sky had turned an ominous greenish-gray, and the wind carried the smell of rain and something else, something wrong. Jeb stood at the edge of the clearing, staring down toward the valley. His face was grim. "What is it?" she asked, joining him. "Storm's coming, not a normal one. See how the clouds are moving?" He pointed to the horizon where dark masses seemed to boil and churn. "That's bad, real bad, and I'm betting Dry Creek's right in its path." "Will they be all right?" He shook his head slowly. "Creek's probably already rising from the snowmelt up here. If this storm dumps as much rain as I think it will, the town'll flood. Could wash away half the buildings. We have to warn them. By the time we get down there, it'll be too late." But even as he said it, he was moving toward the stable. "But we can help after. Bring rope and all the blankets we can spare." They rode hard down the mountain, racing against the storm. Halfway down, the rain hit not gentle drops, but solid sheets of water that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The trail became a river of mud, and twice Lydia's mare nearly lost its footing. By the time they reached Dry Creek, the storm was in full fury. The creek that gave the town its name had swollen to 3 times its normal width, brown water churning with debris. Several buildings on the low side of town were already partially submerged, and people splashed through knee-deep water, trying to save their belongings. Jeb didn't hesitate. He rode straight into the chaos, his voice booming over the storm. "Higher ground! Everyone to higher ground!" But even as he shouted, there was a crack like a cannon shot. Upstream, a massive cottonwood that had been undermined by the flood toppled into the creek. Its branches caught on the bridge, creating a dam that forced water into new channels that ran directly through the center of town. "The bridge is going to break," someone screamed. "If it does, the water will—" The bridge didn't break. it held, which was worse. The diverted water surged down Main Street like a living thing, sweeping away barrels and crates, undermining foundations, turning the entire town into a churning brown nightmare. Lydia saw them then, Mrs. Patterson and 3 of her boarders, trapped on the second floor of the boarding house as water rose steadily around the building's foundation. The elderly woman leaned out the window, screaming for help, but no one could reach them. The current was too strong. Without thinking, Lydia urged her mare toward the building. Jeb shouted something behind her, but she couldn't hear it over the roar of the water. She pushed the horse as close as she dared, then slipped off into water that came up to her chest. The current immediately tried to sweep her away, but she grabbed onto the porch railing and pulled herself forward. "Tie this around you," she shouted up to Mrs. Patterson, throwing one end of the rope she'd brought. "All of you hold on tight. We can't get down," Mrs. Patterson called back. "The stairs are underwater." Lydia looked back. Jeb had followed her, fighting his way through the water with a coil of rope looped over his shoulder. He tied one end to his saddle and the other around his waist, then gestured for her to do the same with her rope. Together, they created a lifeline. One by one, the boarders climbed out the window and down into the water, clinging to the rope as Jeb and Lydia hauled them to safety. Mrs. Patterson came last, her face pale with terror, but determined. They just pulled her to shore when Lydia heard a child crying. She turned to see a small boy, no more than 5 or 6, clinging to the remnants of a fence as the water tried to tear him away. He was alone, probably separated from his parents in the chaos. "I see him!" Lydia shouted, already moving back into the water. "Lydia, no! The current's too strong there." Jeb reached for her, but she was already gone, fighting her way toward the child. The water was deeper here, nearly over her head, and the current pulled at her with terrifying force. Every step was a battle. Her feet slipped on the muddy bottom, and twice she went under, swallowing mouthfuls of filthy water before breaking the surface again. But she kept going. The boy saw her coming and reached out with one small hand, still holding the fence with the other. "Help! Please help!" "I've got you!" Lydia grabbed him just as the fence gave way, wrapping her arms around his small body and turning back toward shore. But the current had her now, spinning them both downstream. She fought desperately, trying to reach something, anything to hold on to. Then a rope dropped from above. She grabbed it with one hand while holding the child with the other, and felt herself being pulled against the current. Jeb hauled them both to shore with strength that seemed impossible even for him, finally depositing them on solid ground where Lydia collapsed, coughing up water and gasping for air. "You damn fool woman," Jeb said, but his hands were gentle as he checked her for injuries. "Brave, but a damn fool." The boy's mother appeared, screaming her son's name and sobbing as she gathered him into her arms. She looked at Lydia with eyes full of tears. "Thank you. Oh, God, thank you. How can I ever—" "Make sure he stays away from the water," Lydia managed between coughs. "That's thanks enough." For the next 6 hours, they worked alongside the other townspeople to rescue those in danger and salvage what could be saved. The storm finally blew itself out near sunset, leaving Dry Creek battered but standing. The flood had caused damage, but thanks to the warning and the rescue efforts, no lives had been lost. As darkness fell and people gathered in the church, one of the few buildings on high enough ground to have escaped damage, Lydia found herself facing the people who'd tormented her for years. Cole Brennan, stood in front of her, his head bowed. His face was clean now, but she remembered vividly the sight of Jeb forcing it into the mud. Behind him stood Wade, Buck, and the others, all looking similarly humbled. "Miss Hartwell," Cole said, his voice barely audible, we want to apologize." She waited, saying nothing. "What we did to you was wrong, cruel, and you saved Buck's little brother today. After everything we did to you, you still—" His voice cracked. "Why? Why would you do that?" Lydia was silent for a long moment, thinking about cruelty and kindness, about the cycles of pain that people inflicted on each other, about the choice she'd made in that muddy water to save a child whose family had never shown her anything but contempt. "Because no one deserves to be left in the mud," she said finally, "not even people who threw me into it." Cole dropped to his knees, and to her shock, the others followed suit. "We're sorry. We are so sorry. We'll do anything to make it right." She looked at their bowed heads, at the genuine remorse in their faces, and felt something inside her shift. The anger she'd carried for so long, anger at them, at the town, at her circumstances, began to dissipate like smoke. "Get up," she said quietly. "All of you. You want to make it right? Then be better. Treat people with kindness. Protect those who can't protect themselves. That's how you make it right." As they stood, someone in the crowd began to clap, then another and another, until the entire church was filled with applause. People she'd never spoken to came forward to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her how brave she'd been. Father Mackenzie, the ancient priest who served Dry Creek's small congregation, raised his hands for silence. "Today, we witnessed something remarkable. We saw courage in the face of danger, and more importantly, we saw forgiveness in the face of cruelty. Miss Lydia Hartwell embodies the Christian virtues we speak of every Sunday: charity, compassion, and grace." He turned to her. "This town owes you a debt we can never fully repay, but we can start by saying thank you, and by promising to do better." Lydia felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of release rather than pain. She looked for Jeb and found him standing in the back of the church, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Later, as they prepared to ride back up the mountain, he approached her. The crowd had dispersed to their temporary shelters, and they stood alone in the darkness, lit only by a lantern hanging from the church door. "You did good today," he said gruffly. "Real good." "So did you." He was quiet for a moment then. "Watching you in that water, risking your life for that boy, I've lived my whole life carrying guilt over Danny, thinking I should have done more, but you showed me something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is try, even when you're scared, even when you might fail." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "My whole life I've been hiding on that mountain, punishing myself for something I couldn't control, but you faced the people who hurt you, and you chose mercy. That takes a kind of strength I don't have." "You have it," Lydia said firmly. "You took me in when no one else would. You protected me. You're the strongest person I've ever met." Jeb shook his head slowly. "I've lived in the mud of hatred and guilt for 30 years, Lydia. But you're the light that makes me want to climb out of it. You make me want to be human again." He took her hands in his, and she realized he was trembling. "What I'm trying to say is, I don't want you working for me anymore. I want you to stay on the mountain, but as my partner, my equal, and maybe, if you're willing, as more than that." Lydia's breath caught. "Jeb, I'm dying," he said bluntly. "Maybe got a year, maybe got 10, I don't know. But however long I've got, I'd like to spend it with someone who sees me as something other than a monster or a legend. Someone who sees just a man." "I do see that," Lydia whispered. "I've seen it for a long time now." "Then stay. Not as someone I pay. As someone I—" He struggled with the words, clearly unused to expressing such feelings. "As someone I love." The word hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Lydia thought about her life before the cruelty, the loneliness, the daily humiliation, and she thought about the cabin on the mountain, about quiet mornings and simple work, about sitting by the fire with this complicated, damaged, kind man who'd given her back her dignity. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." Jeb's face transformed. It wasn't quite a smile. He seemed to have forgotten how to truly smile years ago, but it was close. "Thank you," he said simply. They rode back up the mountain as the stars came out, their horses walking side by side, their future uncertain, but faced together. Word of what had happened spread through the territory like wildfire. The story grew with each telling the fat girl who'd been called Pig had saved an entire town, and the mountain man who'd made her tormentors eat dirt had proven to have a heart after all. When Jeb went to Silver City a month later to trade his furs, the doctor who'd previously told him he was dying took another look and shook his head in wonder. "Don't know what to tell you, Carter. Your lungs sound better." "Not well, mind you, but better. Whatever that woman of yours is doing, keep her doing it." "She's not my woman," Jeb said automatically, then paused. "Well, not yet. Working on it." The doctor laughed. "Good for you, son. Good for you." Throughout that fall and into winter, life on Redstone Ridge settled into a new rhythm. Lydia and Jeb worked side by side during the days processing pelts, maintaining the cabin, preparing for the harsh winter ahead. In the evenings, they talked more than Jeb had talked in decades, sharing stories and dreams and fears. They were careful with each other, neither wanting to rush something that felt too precious to risk. But slowly, gradually, the distance between them closed. It was Lydia who made the first move. On a night when the first snow fell, turning the world outside into a crystalline wonderland, she set down the shirt she was mending and crossed to where Jeb sat, carving by the fire. "Jeb," she said softly. He looked up, and she saw in his eyes that he knew what she was going to say. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon, or that you'd think I was grateful rather than in love. But it's been 2 months, and every day I'm more certain. I love you." He set down his knife carefully and stood, taking her face in his large, scarred hands with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Lydia Hartwell, will you marry me?" "Yes," she breathed. They were married by Father Mackenzie in Dry Creek on the first day of spring. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, not just to witness the wedding, but to celebrate their unlikely heroine. The women brought food enough for a feast, and the men built tables and benches in the churchyard for the celebration afterward. Cole Brennan and his friends were there too, cleaned up and sober, standing respectfully at the back. When the ceremony ended and Jeb kissed his bride a gentle, reverent kiss that spoke of promises and hope, Cole was among the loudest cheering. At the reception, Mrs. Patterson presented Lydia with a gift, a beautiful patchwork quilt, made by all the women of Dry Creek, each square stitched with care. "For your new home," the elderly woman said, tears in her eyes. "And for our new friend." As the sun set and the celebration continued, Jeb pulled Lydia aside. They stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the people dance and laugh. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "Are you?" He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I spent 30 years on that mountain, convinced I didn't deserve happiness, convinced I was meant to be alone. And then you came along and changed everything." "We changed each other," Lydia corrected gently. "That we did." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I know you've always dreamed of having children, and I know my health isn't certain. But if you want—" "I want whatever life we can build together," Lydia interrupted. "Children would be wonderful. But even if it's just you and me on that mountain for however many years we have, that's more than enough." As it turned out, they had both. 15 months after their wedding, Lydia gave birth to a daughter. They named her Grace, and she had her father's gray eyes and her mother's gentle heart. 2 years later came a son they called Daniel, in memory of the brother Jeb had never stopped mourning. Jeb's health did deteriorate over the years, but slowly, much more slowly than the doctor had predicted. Lydia's careful nursing and the peace he'd found in their love gave him years he'd never expected to have. He lived to see both children grow, taught his son to trap and track, and walked his daughter through the mountains on her 7th birthday, showing her the sunset from the ridge where he'd once planned to dig his grave. "I was ready to die up here," he told Grace, holding her small hand as they watched the sky turn gold and crimson. "But your mama taught me how to live instead." By the time Jeb finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68, he'd lived 22 years longer than the doctor had given him. The cabin on Redstone Ridge had become a place of joy and love rather than isolation and penance. At his funeral, the entire town of Dry Creek came to pay their respects. They'd all come to know Jeb in those final years, watching him transform from the silent, frightening mountain man into a devoted husband and father. But more importantly, they'd learned from what he and Lydia represented that people could change, that love could heal, and that mercy was stronger than cruelty. Cole Brennan, now a respectable businessman with a family of his own, gave the eulogy. "Jeb Carter taught us that it's never too late to choose kindness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And Lydia Carter taught us that forgiveness is the greatest strength of all. Together, they showed us how to be better." After the service, as people shared food and memories, little Daniel tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, why do people keep calling you the Angel of Dry Creek?" Lydia smiled, thinking back to the day Jeb had found her covered in mud, crying in the street. To the journey up the mountain, to the life they'd built, to the family she'd never dared dream she could have. "Because your father taught them to see me differently," she said simply, "and I taught them that everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moments. Will you teach me that too?" "Every day," she promised, pulling him close. "Every single day." As the sun set over Dry Creek that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and scarlet, the townspeople looked toward Redstone Ridge and remembered the story that had changed them all. The story of a man who'd lived in darkness until love brought him light, and a woman who'd been called Pig, but proved herself to be the bravest among them. And they remembered that the strongest person isn't the one who never falls into the mud. It's the one who climbs out, brushes themselves off, and extends a hand to help others up as well.